In 1974, an entire family claimed that they were abducted. What makes this story different is they said that their souls were somehow pulled out of their bodies and examined by aliens. And it all started on what should have been just a 15 to 20-minute drive. It was Sunday night, October 27, 1974, about 9:45. John and Elaine Avis and their 3 children were just leaving Elaine's parents' house in Harold Hill, Essex, heading home, which was just a 15-minute drive away in Aveley. Well, just a short bit into their drive, their son Kevin pointed upward. "Hey, look at that light," he said. Both John and Elaine looked into the direction that he was pointing, and hovering just above a set of houses was this strange oval-shaped pale blue light. It looked like it were maybe half in and half out of our reality. That's because it was twinkling like stars do on occasion. And this one just might have passed for a star if it hadn't been a little bit too big and if it hadn't been moving. And the direction that it was moving? Well, it was disturbing because it seemed to be following this family, stopping and starting when they did, keeping perfect pace with their car. Well, the family watched in amazement with anxiety building as this light picked up speed and then passed directly in front of them. Then the road dipped just a bit and bushes blocked the view, and the light traveled out of sight. After a second, without it not reappearing, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Just some strange light in the sky, an interesting tale to share with friends in the future. So they continued on. Well, the road curved gently, and then, without warning, they all felt it. This terrible emotion that something just wasn't right. And as the car came around the bend, the family could see that the entire road ahead was covered in this strange green mist, dense like fog. It was a blanket 8 to 9 feet high and perfectly flat on the top, almost as if it were some solid material, and it completely blocked their path. Now, at the exact same time that they saw this fog, the car radio crackled and it began to smoke, as if it were just about to catch on fire. So John, thinking quickly, reached beneath the dashboard and yanked out the wires. When he did, along with staving off this potential fire, the car headlights shut off. And at that exact moment, they entered this mist. Inside of the mist, everything changed. The air became unnervingly silent and thick, as if they were in a completely different environment. And then the car filled with this bright, hazy light, and a cold, tingling sensation ran through everyone's bodies. Elaine remembered that the car jerked violently. Kevin, who had been standing behind the front seats, fell backward. And then, nothing. Complete blackness, a void of memory, actually. Just a second or two after that, there was another sharp jolt, as if the car had just ran over a speed bump. And then the green mist was gone, and the car was now a half a mile further down the same road, traveling normally. The radio was still disconnected, but the lights were back on and they were working perfectly. Karen and Stuart were still asleep in the back seat. John and Elaine felt shaken and confused, but they had just experienced something that would get anyone's adrenaline running, right? But there was something else, this feeling of violation that they just couldn't explain. When they finally walked in the door, Elaine checked the clock, and just like with so many of these abduction stories, too much time had passed. It should have been just a little past 10 p.m., but it wasn't. It was closer to 1 in the morning. 3 full hours had just vanished from their lives. But this, of course, was only the beginning. The family would soon discover that not only had they been taken into an alien environment, but somehow their souls had been ripped from their bodies.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
Now, we don't know for sure, because Amy's research didn't mention this, But I would imagine that John and Elaine probably had a pretty difficult time falling asleep after an experience like that, right? Strange green mist, a 15-minute trip turning into 3 hours. As a matter of fact, John missed work the next day because he didn't wake up until 11 a.m. And still, he and Elaine both felt extremely tired all day long. Well, life went on, and the memory of the event should have moved into the past as just some super strange night with green fog and missing time. But it didn't. No. In the weeks that followed, the Avis family felt out of sync, and they struggled to get back to their old routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. John and Elaine, of course, just couldn't stop thinking about that 3 hours of time that they lost. How was that even possible? And there was something else. Some sort of uneasiness deep down inside of both of them that they just couldn't quite pinpoint, as if they had both suddenly developed some sort of anxiety disorder. They walked around with lumps in their throats and tensions in their shoulders that they just couldn't place. The children seemed fine on the surface, but something had shifted inside of them as well. It was seemingly worse for John. He had always been a solid, practical person, but suddenly he suffered a nervous breakdown with no apparent reason. His nerves became so bad, in fact, that he had to give up his job, and he didn't go back to work until September of 1975. Elaine, on the other hand, she experienced the opposite effect. She became more confident in herself, and eventually she went back to college, something that she had always wanted to do but never got around to. And strangely, Kevin suddenly became smarter. He had been behind in reading at school, but now, somewhat dramatically, he shot ahead in reading better than most of the other children in his age group. And the whole family made some pretty dramatic changes. I thought these were pretty interesting. For some reason, they all stopped eating meat. They couldn't even stand the smell of it anymore. They became very careful about their food. No preservatives, no artificial colors, no artificial flavors. John and Elaine also grew deeply passionate about protecting the environment and preserving Britain's heritage. John quit smoking, cold turkey, and both of them cut way down on their alcohol. But the strangest things were still yet to come. As the weeks turned into months, the family started to notice odd events, both inside and outside of their home. They began to feel watched, kind of like, Men in Black stuff. John and Elaine said that they remembered being followed for months by the same vehicles: a small red sports car, a blue Jaguar, and a large white car, all with dark windows and new-style British plates. The cars would appear behind them constantly, sometimes following them for hours. One night in 1975, they spotted a car parked across the street from their house. Two men sat inside and carried on a conversation late into the night. Well, around 1 a.m., tired of it, John called the police anonymously. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on John's door. Well, he opened it to find a short, stocky man with black hair wearing a blue raincoat. The man identified himself as a police officer responding to John's call. Well, John was stunned. He had never given his name nor his address. Well, John pointed to the car and verified his complaint. This so-called policeman looked at it and then left without showing any ID. Moments later, the car drove away. Strange things also started happening inside of the house. Objects would go missing from one room only to turn up days later in another. Pens, pencils, a roll of film, even a hole punch, all vanished without a trace. Things go missing with all families from time to time, but this was different. Way too many items, and sometimes someone would be using something, set it down, turn around, and it would be gone. Crazy stuff like that happened all of the time. They also heard this low humming noise outside of their home late at night that sounded like a distant aircraft growing louder and louder, moving across the roof. But then the noise would just suddenly stop. They heard sharp crackling sounds inside of the living room that moved from corner to corner. On 3 separate occasions, they heard what they thought sounded like Morse code coming from inside of one of the bedrooms. Well, these strange anomalies kept happening, and a little bit later in the video, I'm going to get into some pretty crazy ones that seem as if they're more connected to the spiritual world than the UFO world. But they all pointed back to that Sunday night in October of 1974. By 1977, John and Elaine were so desperate for answers that they reached out to a local UFO researcher named Andrew Collins. He suggested that they try hypnotic regression to recover maybe missing memories. Well, John agreed. He just had to know what had happened that night. Elaine was hesitant at first, but eventually she came around. The sessions took place over 3 Sundays in September and October of 1977. Under hypnosis, John began to recall events that initially he had no memory of. That night in the car, there was this powerful white pillar of light that cut through the green mist and latched onto the car like an iron hook. Then there was this sensation of rising. A moment later, John found himself standing on some sort of a balcony with a railing, looking down into a wide open area that reminded him of a large airplane hangar. Below, he saw his own car, and inside of the car, he saw himself and his entire family, all unconscious. He was literally looking down at his own body. But if that were the case, then what was he using to see with, right? And in what vessel? Because it wasn't his body that he was in, so where was his essence being kept? Well, things would get even stranger, because soon, even though his body had been left behind in the car, he would experience that dreaded medical examination that so many abductees remember going through. And somehow, he would feel it as he went through it. As John was looking down at his body, he felt a presence standing behind him, so naturally he turned around, and he saw this tall humanoid with the strangest face. It was pale, extremely pale, almost translucent, and its overall appearance was smooth and mostly featureless, except for his eyes. They were large and pronounced, larger than human eyes, with pink irises instead of green, blue, or brown, and cream-colored eyeballs instead of white. The rest of the face seemed to be absent, with no noticeable nose or mouth. Haunting, for sure. Well, the next thing that John knew, he was moving along with this entity straight toward this featureless wall. When they got right up to the wall, a hole appeared out of nowhere. John entered this hole, and then he felt himself ascending a short distance and then emerging in this small oval room. In the center of the room, there was this table with lights above it. Then this entity reached out and he touched where John's shoulder should have been if he had a body. And then everything went black. When John regained awareness, he was laying flat on the table. A rectangular bar about 3 foot long floated about 18 inches above him and moved slowly from his head toward his feet. The underside had this honeycomb pattern to it, and it glowed faintly. As it passed over each part of him, John said that he felt a distinct tingling warmth exactly where the bar was passing. Now, I have to tell you, I thought that this part was extremely strange, right? Because even though his body had supposedly been left behind, he seemed to have experienced everything here in this room, as if he had a body, one that seemed locked to the table, but one that could feel everything. To his right, there were 3 of those nearly faceless entities, and John found himself asking if he could please get up, as he wanted nothing more than to get out of this place. Well, the answer came back quickly and telepathically, and it also had this calming effect to it. No, why don't you just sit here for a while? And just as those thoughts were appearing in his head, he noticed that to his left, there were 2 very strange-looking beings. We typed their description into an AI generator, and we got these images. They stood right about 4 feet tall and wore long white gowns that reached the floor, something like a doctor's lab coat, which was odd because they had this animal-like appearance. As you can see, they were covered in fur and they had no necks, so they were slightly hunched forward. They were stocky and they moved awkwardly. Their eyes were slanted, something like triangles, and they had this beak for a nose. Their mouths were tiny, just slits, and they had large hairy hands with 4 digits on each one and these long talons or nails that protruded from each finger. John also noted that occasionally they made guttural chirping sounds. Well, he ended up referring to them as examiners. One of these examiners began moving a pin-like instrument slowly over John's body. It was about 8 inches long, with an intense white light at the tip that never actually touched John, always staying about a half an inch away. As this instrument went over John, he felt that same warm tingling sensation he had felt with that honeycomb bar. John said that at times, the guttural chirping sounded like these beings were almost, humming or singing happily while they worked. And although they looked like animals, well, they moved and they acted with such high level of dexterity and competency that it screamed superintelligence. As they worked, the 3 taller entities just stood there silently watching. John later said that their lack of facial features made them feel as if their faces were maybe synthetic, or like maybe they were wearing masks. After the scans were finished, John was allowed to sit up. He felt loose and weak, as if his muscles were made of rubber, and that's when he noticed that he did indeed have a body. One that, to his amazement, was dressed in one of those one-piece garments, exactly like the ones that these tall entities were wearing. John said that it fit perfectly and it felt as if it were like a second skin. Well, a moment later, those faceless entities approached the table, and when they did, interestingly, those shorter examiners backed away without question, kind of implying hierarchy. Well, that's when John felt that he could ask questions. So he got real curious, asking all sorts of questions. One question that I thought was particularly interesting was when he asked about a certain visor that was there in the room. One of these aliens explained that occasionally they had to use a device like that so that they could see clearly in our atmosphere.
We find this unfortunate, the use of this visor, because we see through your eyes for most purposes. But there are many occasions when we cannot find suitable eyes, so we use the visor to change your light to match our optic nerves.
I thought that was extremely interesting because what does that even mean? We see through your eyes for most purposes. So they what? Possess us? They harvest our eyes? No. Whatever it is, that sounds insane. Well, after that, John was allowed to walk through parts of their craft, and he saw connecting tunnels, a laboratory with advanced equipment far beyond his understanding. Eventually, he was brought into a room where 4 more faceless entities sat at a crescent-shaped panel. They moved their hands over controls without touching anything, something like a futuristic sci-fi movie. Shortly after this, John was taken into another room and he was told to lie down. Above his head was a disc-shaped device, and a screen appeared on the wall, and he began flashing hundreds of images, maps, star charts, and diagrams at an incredible speed. Simultaneously, he received explanations for each one directly into his mind. Well, at one point, John said that the information was coming just way too fast. But the faceless entity said, "Don't worry, it's all being locked in to your mind." Now, while all of this was going on, Elaine was going through her own experience. And for her, at least at first, it was terrifying. She remembered being led into a similar examination room. She was placed on one of those flat tables, and 2 of those examiner types moved over her with that same pin-like instrument. For some reason, they paid special attention to the area right around her left kidney. Well, she just couldn't calm down, so one of those tall entities stepped forward, placed his middle finger on her forehead and his 2 outer fingers right on the outside of her eyes, and then she passed out. When she came to, she was wearing that same one piece that everybody else wore. And she too was given a tour of their craft, and at one point, she also had information downloaded into her mind. When she expressed concern for her children, like, where are they? I thought this was extremely interesting. She was told, again, telepathically,
"Your children are safe. You value your children. We understand that, but we do not reproduce. We do not have children. We reproduce through you. So, in that way, you are our children."
That's deep, right? I mean, like, what does that even mean? Well, eventually, both John and Elaine were led back to that hangar area, and they saw their car down below. A few moments later, Elaine saw John down there, getting into the car. And suddenly, a feeling bubbled up within Elaine, a strong emotion not to return, but to stay with these strange entities. At the very moment that she began to feel that, oddly, she was told telepathically that she could stay if that's what she wished to do. And as she was pondering this foreign emotion and their statement of acceptance, she watched as the car dematerialized. And these beings just watched her emotions. And instantly, she was filled with panic. I don't want to stay. Well, that's when she felt this wave of comfort, and then she watched as everything around her began to dissolve and fade away. And then, for just a moment, she was somewhere in the air, watching the car traveling along the road by the woods. The next moment, she was sitting inside of the car, closing the door, and filled with a sense of relief that she was once again reunited with her family. And then she felt that jolt as if they had just went over a speed bump, and the experience was over. Elaine said later that thinking back, she believes that the whole experience of her wanting to stay there was a carefully orchestrated test. For some reason, these entities wanted to see what her reaction would be in that situation. Well, the nightmare was over, but the real changes were only just beginning. And when the Avis family finally walked through the front door of their home that night, they had no idea that the beings had left them with something much more than just this experience. As I said earlier, after this experience, things changed dramatically for the Avis family. John had a nervous breakdown, Elaine became noticeably more confident, and she went back to college. Kevin did a complete 180 with his school lessons, going from the bottom of the class to the very top of the class. The whole family's diet changed. Their feeling about the environment changed. But there was something more. Something crazy. Something that makes me wonder if maybe sometimes some ghost stories are somehow connected to extraterrestrial stories, or maybe ultra-terrestrial stories, I guess. One day when Elaine was on the telephone with her sister-in-law, the back door just opened and slammed into the wall wildly. The crazy part? Elaine had just come in from the outside and locked it, deadbolt and all. Then on Wednesday, December 13th, 1977, John and Elaine were in the living room watching television when, now check this out, all of a sudden a small clock radio that had been sitting on top of their television set slowly began to rise until it was hovering about 3 inches above the set before it finally dropped back down. Strange, isn't it? One night in late 1975 or 76, Kevin claimed that he saw a man standing beside his bed, dressed like a clown. Now, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Stuff like that would absolutely terrify me to death. Door handles would turn with no one on the other side of the door. On Sunday, October 16, 1977, researcher Andrew Collins took John and Elaine home from a regression session in North London. Well, it was late, so he stayed there and he slept on the sofa. During the night, he was awakened by crashing sounds coming from the kitchen. He said that it sounded as if someone were hitting the pots and pans real hard. Well, he might have been able to chalk that up to the family just trying to spook him, if it hadn't been for the fact that just a moment or two later, he felt this strange sensation at his feet. It gradually moved up his whole body until it passed over his head. He said that it was very stimulating and soothing. He said that this happened more than once. Oddly, this feeling somehow gave him a sense of calming, and it put him at ease. It seems like it would have done the opposite for me, right? The family cat would suddenly back away and hiss at unseen things in the living room. The family's telephone would ring and no one would be on the other end of the line. Well, they would ask repeatedly who was there, but they would get nothing. And then there's the conspiracy side of things. During 1975, John was stopped repeatedly by the police and asked to show his documents. And as I said earlier, this all came to a boil, and by 1977, the family was desperate for answers. And that's when they agreed to that hypnotic regression, and that's when they discovered that they had been taken out of their bodies and aboard that craft. With this one, it's easy to be skeptical, right? 3 lost hours, and all we have to verify this is John and Elaine's testimony. 2 of the children were asleep, and the third one doesn't remember much at all. Skeptics would say that this whole thing just might be explained away easily with something like stress or shared hallucinations or intentional fabrication. The life changes are interesting, but they could be coincidental, right? I mean, people change all of the time, and we're often surprised when they do. Now, don't be mad at me for being skeptical. It's in my nature. And remember, there was no hard evidence to this. There was no photographs. There was no artifacts. Just memories recovered under hypnosis, even. The family's testimony. And to my knowledge, nothing ever became of those memory downloads that the family claimed that they received. Why download information into someone if it's never going to come out? Now, on the flip side, the Avis family was known to be just ordinary, honest, hardworking people. They didn't have any history of mental illness or attention-seeking behavior, and their accounts under hypnosis were remarkably consistent, even when they were questioned separately. Even though people do change dramatically from time to time, the changes in this family's personalities, their diet, their worldview, they were profound, immediate, and they were permanent. The strange physical events in their home, the levitating radio, the moving door handles, the disappearing objects, they were witnessed by multiple people, including visitors. So, what really happened to the Avis family that October 9th, 1974? Maybe it was just a strange psychological experience triggered by that bizarre green fog. Or maybe, just as they said, something reached out of that fog and pulled their consciousnesses out of their bodies, examined their souls like specimens, showed them a glimpse into a much larger reality, and then somehow gently put them back in place, forever altered. Either way, the Avis family never looked at the night sky the same way again, and perhaps neither should we.
While researching this case, I was genuinely struck by John and Elaine's description of the examiners and their uncanny resemblance to owls. So, of course, I went down a rabbit hole. The owl connection to alien encounters is surprisingly common. Some say that owls are screen memories. Others see them as symbols of wisdom or prophecy. And some argue that what people think are aliens just might be misidentified owls. I know, it sounded crazy to me too, but seriously, look up baby owls and tell me they don't look a little like an extraterrestrial. But speaking of owls, please consider flying over to our Buy Me a Coffee page. As you know, it's just Damon and me, and your support truly helps to keep these stories coming.